Admiral Kethvar stood in the command center of his massive warship, watching the screens that showed another planet turned to ash. The blue and green world of Kepler 442b was now nothing but a smoking ball of rock and fire. His ship, the Eternal Dominion, had just finished destroying every city, every town, every sign of life that had dared to rebel against the Zephyrian Empire. The bridge around him was made of living crystal that pulsed with soft light. Everything was smooth and beautiful, grown rather than built. His officers moved quietly between the crystal panels, their hands dancing over controls that responded to thought as much as touch. This was how real civilizations built their ships, not with crude metal and welding, but with technology so advanced it seemed like magic. "Sir, the outer rim sectors report complete pacification," his second-in-command Subcommander Velthara said, her voice echoing slightly in the crystal chamber. She was young for her rank, but she had proven herself in dozens of these planetary cleansing operations. The bridge crew continued their work, each movement precise and practiced. They had done this so many times before. Kethvar nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the dying world below. Once, millions of people had lived on that planet. They had built cities that reached toward the sky, created art, raised families, and dreamed of the future. Now there was nothing left but cooling lava and drifting ash clouds. "Schedule the next system for subjugation," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "These primitives must learn their place in the natural order. This was how the galaxy worked. The strong ruled the weak, the advanced crushed the primitive. For 3,000 years, the Zephyrian Empire had been the undisputed master of known space. Their ships were works of art as much as weapons of war. Each crystalline hull was grown over decades in quantum gardens, shaped by minds that understood the deepest secrets of matter and energy. Their plasma lances could cut through anything, turn entire continents into glass, boil oceans into steam. The Empire's doctrine was beautifully simple: complete technological superiority backed by weapons that could crack planets in half. Every ship in their fleet was unique, a masterpiece crafted by the finest minds in the galaxy. Their crystalline hulls had never been scratched by enemy fire. Their energy shields had never failed. Their plasma weapons had never met anything they could not destroy. They were the apex predators of space, the ultimate evolution of warfare. Lesser species learned quickly to submit or face extinction. The Empire had destroyed hundreds of civilizations, each one thinking they could resist, each one learning too late that resistance was futile. Some tried to hide in the dark spaces between stars. Others attempted desperate alliances with neighboring systems. A few even tried to fight back with primitive missiles and kinetic weapons. All of them ended the same way, as cooling debris, orbiting dead worlds. Kethvar had personally overseen the destruction of 47 separate species. Each time, he felt the same satisfaction of bringing order to chaos, civilization to barbarism. The galaxy was vast and full of primitive minds that could not understand their proper place in the hierarchy of existence. It was the Empire's burden to teach them, even if the lesson ended in their complete annihilation. The bridge fell silent, except for the soft humming of the crystal systems. Outside the transparent walls, space stretched endlessly in all directions, full of stars and worlds waiting to learn the same lesson that Kepler 442b had just learned. The Zephyrian Empire would continue its march across the galaxy, bringing order through superior firepower, until every primitive species understood their place in the natural order of things. 3 days after the destruction of Kepler 442b, something strange appeared on the long-range sensors. Lieutenant Velimora was the first to notice it, her crystal workstation suddenly flashing with warning lights as the detection grid picked up an unknown contact. She leaned forward, her trained eyes scanning the readings with growing confusion. The object was big, really big, almost 2 kilometers from front to back, which made it larger than most Imperial cruisers, but everything else about it was completely wrong. Velimora ran the scans 3 times, certain her equipment was malfunctioning, before she finally accepted what she was seeing. "Admiral," she called across the bridge, her voice uncertain. "The object appears to be constructed from metal alloys, simple iron and titanium composites. She paused, still staring at her readings. "Sir, this thing is made of the same materials we use for cargo containers and mining equipment." Captain Velthara looked up from her station and laughed. "Primitive, probably debris from one of the colonies we missed. Maybe some kind of industrial facility that got knocked loose during the bombardment." She turned back to her work, dismissing the contact as unimportant. But Lieutenant Velmora kept watching, and what she saw made no sense. The object wasn't drifting like debris should. Instead, it maintained perfect trajectory control, making small course corrections with mechanical precision. Its path was too straight, too purposeful to be anything but deliberate navigation. As the contact drew closer, the detailed scanners began to reveal more disturbing information. The vessel's design was completely unlike anything in Imperial databases. Where Zephyrian ships were smooth and organic, flowing like living creatures, this thing was blocky and angular. It looked like someone had taken a bunch of metal boxes and welded them together in the most efficient way possible. The hull plating showed obvious weld seams running along every surface, external components that any civilized species would integrate. Into the superstructure were just bolted onto the outside. Weapon mounts, sensor arrays, and what looked like engine exhaust stuck out at odd angles, giving the whole vessel the appearance of an industrial accident rather than a spacecraft. Admiral Kethvar finally moved from his command position to study the tactical display personally. The unknown vessel was heading directly toward their fleet, showing no signs of changing course or slowing down. "It's coming straight at us," he murmured, his crystalline fingers dancing over the holographic. "Controls. Activate identification protocols. Find out what this thing is." The communications array sent out the standard Imperial greeting, a complex quantum entanglement signal that should have been answered by any spacefaring civilization. But the approaching vessel remained silent, continuing its steady approach toward the Zephyrian fleet. As it came closer, more details became visible. The mysterious ship measured nearly 2 kilometers in length, but it was built like no spacecraft they had ever seen. Instead of the elegant energy weapons that marked advanced civilizations, it bristled with what appeared to be crude projectile launchers. Dozens of them lined the hull in organized rows, each one obviously designed to throw solid objects rather than manipulate exotic energy fields. The sensor readings showed no energy signature that would indicate shielding technology or exotic matter manipulation. No quantum field generators, no gravity wave projectors, no plasma containment systems. The entire vessel appeared to run on simple chemical reactions and basic physics. It looked like something built in a factory rather than grown in a quantum shipyard, assembled by machines rather than shaped by minds that understood the deeper mysteries of the universe. Most disturbing of all, it was coming directly toward them with obvious hostile intent. When the Zephyrian fleet finally sent their standard greeting signals, the primitive vessel actually responded. But the transmission that came back made the Imperial translation computers work harder than they had in centuries. The language was completely unlike anything in their vast databases, full of harsh sounds and simple word structures that seemed almost primitive compared to the flowing musical languages of advanced civilizations. The communications officer, Sub-Commander Valkyra, frowned as she worked to decode the message. The translation matrix kept throwing up error codes, struggling with concepts that didn't seem to translate properly. When the final version appeared on her screen, she read it aloud, with obvious confusion. "This is Captain Lee of the UES Indomitable. You will cease bombardment of civilian populations and withdraw from this system immediately." The entire bridge fell silent for a moment. Then Admiral Kethvar began to laugh, the sound echoing off the crystalline walls and growing louder as other officers joined in. The idea that this crude metal box was giving orders to the most powerful fleet in the galaxy was beyond ridiculous. It was like an insect commanding a storm to stop blowing. "Primitive demands from a primitive species," Kethvar said, wiping tears from his eyes. "They don't even understand what they're facing." He gestured toward the weapons control station. "Show them Imperial power. Perhaps a demonstration will help them understand their situation." The Eternal Dominion's main plasma lance began to charge, crystal conduits throughout the ship, glowing brighter as enormous amounts of energy flowed toward the weapon array. The lance was the pride of Zephyrian engineering, capable of melting through the cores of planets, or turning entire moons into expanding clouds of superheated gas. It had never failed to impress visiting dignitaries or terrify rebellious colonies. A large asteroid drifted nearby, probably knocked loose during the recent bombardment of the planet. It was perfect for a demonstration, big enough to make an impressive explosion, close enough for the primitive vessel to get detailed sensor readings of what was about to happen to them. The plasma lance fired with the brilliance of a small star. The beam struck the asteroid dead center, and for a brief moment the chunk of rock glowed white-hot before simply ceasing to exist. What had been thousands of tons of solid stone became an expanding cloud of plasma that painted the surrounding space in brilliant colors. The display was beautiful and terrifying, a perfect example of what separated advanced civilizations from primitive ones. There, Admiral Kethva transmitted on the same frequency the primitives had used. Observe what awaits those who challenge the Zephyrian Empire. That asteroid was approximately the same size as your vessel. Withdraw now, and your death will be swift. Continue this foolish approach and we will take our time destroying you piece by piece. The Imperial bridge crew settled back to watch the primitive vessel turn and flee, as every other species had done when faced with such overwhelming superiority. The demonstration had never failed. No civilization in the galaxy was stupid enough to face Zephyrian plasma weapons after seeing what they could do. But the human vessel's response came immediately, and it was nothing like what they expected. Demonstration received. Threat assessment updated. Engaging hostile forces. Instead of turning away, the ugly metal ship actually began to accelerate toward them, its crude engines burning brighter as it picked up speed. Warning lights began, flashing on tactical displays as the vessel's weapon systems came online. Not elegant energy weapons, but simple projectile launchers that looked like they belonged on an industrial mining platform. The primitives were actually going to fight. The human ship's weapons didn't glow or hum with exotic energy like proper weapons should. Instead, they simply clicked into position with mechanical precision, like giant versions of the industrial tools used in mining operations. There was no dramatic buildup of power, no swirling quantum fields or crackling energy discharges. Just simple metal tubes pointing toward the Zephyrian fleet. What happened next would be talked about in Imperial military academies for generations to come, assuming there were any left to tell the story. The first projectiles launched from the Indomitable looked like simple metal rods, nothing more threatening than construction materials. But these weren't ordinary pieces of metal. They had been accelerated to 17% of light speed, turning each tungsten rod into a weapon more devastating than most species' largest bombs. The physics were simple and brutal. When something that heavy hits something else at that speed, the results are catastrophic. The Eternal Dominion's shields had protected the ship for over 2 centuries. They had deflected plasma lances that could melt continents, absorbed antimatter explosions that could crack moons, and turned aside energy beams that could boil entire oceans. The crystalline barrier around the ship was considered completely impenetrable by every military expert in the galaxy. The human projectiles passed through the shields like they weren't even there. "Impossible!" Captain Velthara screamed as her control station exploded in a shower of crystal fragments. "Our shields have never been breached. The barriers are still active." But even as she spoke, she could see the truth on her tactical displays. The shields were indeed still functioning perfectly, but they had been designed to stop energy weapons, not solid objects moving at relativistic speeds. The kinetic penetrators punched through the Eternal Dominion's hull with surgical precision, leaving perfectly circular holes that went completely through the ship from one side to the other. Each projectile had been aimed at specific targets: weapons arrays, engine components, shield generators, and communication systems. The humans weren't just shooting randomly. They knew exactly where to hit to cause maximum damage. More projectiles followed in a steady stream, each one accelerated to velocities that turned simple tungsten rods into planet-killing weapons. The bridge shuddered violently as secondary explosions rippled through the ship's crystalline matrix. Systems that had functioned flawlessly for centuries suddenly went dark. The elegant crystal corridors filled with smoke and the screams of injured crew members. Lieutenant Velzira tried desperately to restore power to the weapon systems, but the human projectiles had severed the main conduits with impossible accuracy. "Sir, primary weapons are offline. They hit every single plasma conduit simultaneously." Then came the voice that would haunt Admiral Kethavar's nightmares for the rest of his life. It came through their communication system, despite the fact that their transmitters had been destroyed, speaking in that harsh, primitive language that their computers could barely translate. "This is Captain Park aboard the UES Indomitable. Hostile. Shields neutralized. Switching to precision targeting. Recommend immediate surrender to minimize casualties." The words were spoken in a calm, professional tone, like a doctor discussing routine surgery. There was no anger, no excitement, no satisfaction at having crippled the most powerful warship in the Imperial fleet. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered by someone who treated interstellar warfare like a technical problem to be solved efficiently. Kethavar stared at the tactical display in complete shock, watching as damage reports flooded in from every section of his ship. A primitive metal vessel had just crippled the most advanced dreadnought in the Imperial fleet, using nothing but accelerated chunks of metal. Everything he had believed about warfare, about technology, about the natural order of the galaxy, had just been proven completely wrong. The age of Zephyrian supremacy was over, ended by a species that built their ships in factories and treated physics like a weapon. The remaining ships of the Imperial fleet moved into attack formation, their crystalline hulls gleaming as they prepared to overwhelm this single primitive vessel through sheer numbers. Surely one ship, no matter how lucky its first attack had been, could not stand against the combined might of 12 Zephyrian dreadnoughts. Admiral Kethavar watched from the damaged bridge of his flagship as his captains coordinated their assault. But as the battle continued, the humans revealed capabilities that made no sense according to everything the Empire knew about advanced warfare. Their ship used no exotic technologies at all. There were no gravity manipulators bending space around the vessel, no exotic matter reactors providing unlimited energy, no energy shields flickering with quantum fire. Instead, the Indomitable relied on something far more disturbing: simple, brutal efficiency. When Imperial plasma lances struck the human vessel, the hull didn't disintegrate as it should have. Instead, reactive armor plates absorbed the energy and channeled it away through massive heat dissipation systems. The ship's outer hull actually changed and adapted to incoming fire, becoming more resistant with each attack. It was like fighting an enemy that learned from every wound. Even more troubling were the defensive systems. Point defense turrets covered every surface of the human ship, small weapons that moved with mechanical precision to intercept incoming projectiles. Sub-Commander Velkova watched in amazement as these simple guns destroyed 97% of everything the Imperial fleet fired at them. "Their vessel predicts our firing patterns," she reported from the sensor station, her voice filled with disbelief. "Sir, they're calculating our tactics faster than we can implement them. Every time we adjust our attack approach, they've already prepared countermeasures." The response came through their communications array in that same calm, professional tone they were beginning to dread. "This is Commander Kim aboard the Indomitable. Your weapons follow predictable energy discharge patterns. Our targeting computers have adapted accordingly. Further resistance is futile." The words were spoken without emotion, like a technician explaining why a piece of equipment wasn't working properly. There was no boasting, no threats, just a simple statement of technical fact that somehow made it even more terrifying. As the battle continued, the Imperial officers began to understand something that chilled them to their cores. The Indomitable moved through space with purposeful efficiency, its engines producing simple chemical thrust rather than the elegant gravity wave propulsion that marked truly advanced civilizations. But every system aboard appeared designed for one thing: reliability in combat. Where Zephyrian ships were works of art, grown from living crystal and shaped by centuries of tradition, the human vessel was purely functional. Redundant components meant that destroying one system didn't disable the ship. Modular construction allowed damaged sections to be sealed off and bypassed. Mechanical backup systems ensured that even if the main computers failed, the ship could continue fighting. "They built that ship to fight," Captain Velthara whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of alarms and damage reports. Not for exploration or diplomacy or scientific research, just war. Pure, efficient war. Admiral Kethover watched his supposedly invincible fleet struggle against an enemy that treated starship combat like an engineering problem requiring systematic solution. The humans didn't see battle as an art form or a test of superior technology. To them, it was simply a technical challenge to be solved with the right tools and sufficient preparation, and they had come very well prepared indeed. Admiral Kethover watched as 3 of his most powerful dreadnoughts moved into position around the human vessel. The Radiant Dawn, Stellar Pride, and Crystal Spear were among the finest ships in the Imperial fleet, each one a masterpiece of Zephyrian engineering that had taken decades to grow in the quantum shipyards. Their captains were experienced veterans who had perfected the classic pincer maneuver over countless battles. The tactic was simple and had never failed. 2 ships would approach from opposite sides, while the third came in from above, creating a triangle of crossfire that no enemy could escape. The combined plasma lance fire from 3 dreadnoughts could turn a small moon into vapor. Against a single primitive vessel, it should have been instant victory. Captain Velnara of the Radiant Dawn coordinated the attack, her voice crackling over the tactical channel. All ships, execute pincer formation 7. Target their engine section and weapons arrays simultaneously. We'll cripple them first, then finish them slowly. But as the 3 massive crystalline ships closed in, the human vessel did something unexpected. Instead of trying to escape or focus on one attacker, it began systematically dismantling their entire formation with terrifying efficiency. The Indomitable's targeting systems locked onto the lead dreadnought's weapon arrays with mechanical precision. Kinetic rounds launched at incredible speeds, each one aimed at specific points along the Radiant Dawn's crystalline hull. The projectiles didn't just punch holes, they severed plasma conduits, destroyed focusing crystals, and dismantled weapons systems piece by piece. Within seconds, the most powerful guns in the Imperial fleet were reduced to expensive scrap metal. The second ship, Stellar Pride, tried to use its superior speed to get behind the human vessel. But the Indomitable's point, defense systems tracked the dreadnought's movement with computer-guided accuracy. Her sustained barrage of smaller projectiles carved through the ship's crystalline hull like it was made of glass instead of the strongest materials known to Zephyrian science. Captain Velthara, watching from the damaged bridge of the Eternal Dominion, suddenly understood something that made her blood run cold. "They're not trying to destroy us," she said, her voice filled with dawning horror. "Look at the targeting patterns. They're disabling our ships, not killing them." It was true. Every human weapon strike hit critical systems: engines, weapons, communications, life support control centers. But they carefully avoided crew quarters, medical bays, and escape pod launch tubes. The humans were fighting with surgical precision, neutralizing threats while minimizing casualties. The third dreadnought, Crystal Spear, managed to get close enough to score several direct hits on the human vessel. Captain Velkira watched with satisfaction as her ship's plasma lances struck the primitive hull plating, certain that she would finally see this metal box vaporize like it should have from the beginning. Instead, the human ship's armor absorbed the massive energy discharge and channeled it away through heat dissipation systems that glowed white-hot for a few seconds before returning to normal. The hull plating actually seemed to become more resistant to energy weapons after being hit, as if the ship was learning how to defend itself. The response from the human vessel was immediate and professional. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Ryu aboard. The Indomitable. Hostile fire ineffective. Adjusting countermeasures. Recommend immediate ceasefire to prevent further damage to your vessels." Within minutes, all 3 Imperial dreadnoughts drifted powerless in space. Their engines were dead, their weapons destroyed, their communication systems severed. But their crews were alive, their life support systems carefully preserved by an enemy that could have killed them all but chose not to. The humans had demonstrated something far more terrifying than superior firepower. They had shown restraint, precision, and a level of tactical control that suggested they weren't just better at fighting, they were better at everything. While the disabled Imperial dreadnoughts drifted helplessly in space, the communications specialists aboard the Eternal Dominion worked frantically to intercept and decode human transmissions. What they discovered in those casual conversations between the human ship and its command structure would haunt the Zephyrian Empire forever. Lieutenant Velmora sat hunched over her translation console, her face growing paler with each message she decoded. The human language was starting to make more sense as their computers learned the patterns, but the content of what she was hearing made her wish she had never learned to understand it at all. "Admiral?" she called across the damaged bridge, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Sir, you need to hear this. The ship that just destroyed half our fleet. It's scheduled for decommission." Admiral Kethvar limped over to her station, his crystalline uniform cracked from the battle damage. "What do you mean, decommission?" "The intercepted transmissions, sir. They're talking about the Indomitable, like it's an old piece of equipment they're planning to throw away. They keep referring to older ships and updated models and next-generation replacements. Sir, to them, this vessel is obsolete technology." The words hit the bridge crew like a physical blow. The ship that had just single-handedly crippled the most powerful fleet in Imperial space was considered outdated junk by its own builders. If this was what humans threw away, what did their current military vessels look like? More disturbing revelations followed as the communications team decoded additional transmissions. The humans discussed building warships the same way other species talked about manufacturing tools or producing food. Their military doctrine treated these massive vessels as consumable resources, items to be mass-produced and replaced as needed. "They're talking about shipyard production quotas," Velmora reported, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hundreds of vessels per manufacturing cycle. So they build fleets the way we build individual ships." Then came the transmission that broke what remained of Imperial confidence. Captain Han's voice, calm and professional as always, reporting back to his superiors. "Single Imperial engagement complete. Enemy fleet neutralized with minimal casualties. Recommend full diplomatic contact with 12 ship squadron to demonstrate peaceful intentions." 12 ships. The humans thought 12 of their vessels would be appropriate for peaceful first contact, a friendly gesture to show they meant no harm. What the Empire considered its greatest military achievement, assembling a fleet of 12 dreadnoughts, the humans saw as a polite greeting. Admiral Kethvar stared at the tactical analysis his surviving officers had compiled. The human vessel showed clear signs of mass production everywhere they looked. Components were identical across different sections of the ship, fittings were standardized to allow quick replacement, and manufacturing tolerances suggested assembly. Line construction rather than careful individual crafting. "They don't build superior ships," he said slowly, the realization dawning on him like a cold sunrise. "They build as many ships as they need." The implications were more terrifying than any weapon the humans had displayed. The Zephyrian Empire had spent 3,000 years perfecting the art of individual vessel construction. Each dreadnought was unique, a work of art that took decades to grow in quantum gardens, shaped by master craftsmen who understood the deepest secrets of crystalline engineering. Every ship was irreplaceable, a precious treasure that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and skill. But humans apparently stamped out warships like industrial products. They had turned the construction of space-capable military vessels into a manufacturing process, something that could be scaled up or down based on need. Where the Empire created masterpieces, humans made tools. Where Zephyrians grew ships like living things, humans built them like machines. And machines could be built in unlimited quantities as fast as the factories could produce them. The age of handcrafted excellence was ending, crushed under the weight of industrial capacity that could produce adequate solutions faster than artists could create perfect ones. The emergency beacon that Admiral Kethvar had activated 3 hours earlier finally brought the response he had been desperately hoping for. Hyperspace portals began opening across the Kepler system as the full might of the Zephyrian Empire arrived to save what remained of his fleet. 200 crystalline dreadnoughts emerged from the swirling energy gates, each one a masterpiece of Imperial engineering that had taken decades to construct. It was the largest military force the Empire had ever assembled in one place. Ships that had been scattered across 1,000 star systems for centuries now gathered together, their crystalline hulls gleaming like jewels against the darkness. Out of space, Admiral Kethvar felt a surge of hope as he watched the massive fleet take formation around his position. Surely no force in the galaxy could stand against such overwhelming power. Captain Velthara limped to the sensor station, her uniform torn and bloodied from the earlier battle. "All fleet elements have arrived, sir. 200 dreadnoughts reporting ready for combat. Whatever these humans think they can do with one ship, they're about to learn the true meaning of Imperial power." But even as she spoke, the long-range sensors began detecting new contacts emerging from hyperspace. At first, it was just a few scattered signals at the edge of detection range, then dozens, then hundreds. "Admiral," Velthara's voice dropped to barely a whisper, "I'm reading thousands of contacts." The human fleet didn't arrive all at once like the Imperial response force. Instead, they emerged from hyperspace with mechanical precision, each group taking predetermined positions in a formation so large it stretched across multiple star systems. There was no chaos, no confusion, no ships bumping into each other as they tried to find their places. Just smooth, efficient deployment of military assets on a scale that defied imagination. As the human vessels came closer, their true nature became terrifyingly clear. Each ship was larger than the Indomitable, and their hull configurations showed obvious technological progression. These weren't copies of the same basic design. They were clearly improved models, advanced versions with better armor, enhanced weapons, and more sophisticated targeting systems. The transmission that came from the human fleet was delivered in the same calm, professional tone that had become so familiar and so frightening. "Zephyrian forces, this is Fleet Admiral Cho commanding. The Second Human Contact Fleet. You are ordered to stand down immediately and prepare for diplomatic negotiations. Any attempt to continue hostilities will result in the complete neutralization of your forces." 2,000 human warships arranged, themselves in perfect geometric formation, their weapons trained on the Imperial fleet with mathematical precision. The formation was so exact, so perfectly coordinated, that it looked like a single massive organism rather than individual vessels. Each human ship represented industrial capacity that could replace it within months rather than decades if it were destroyed. Sub-Commander Velkova struggled with her damaged sensor array, trying to get accurate readings on the enemy force. When she finally managed to compile the data, her report came out in a voice filled with despair. "Sir, their fleet displacement exceeds our entire Imperial Navy by a factor of 12. And sir, these aren't even their newest ships." The intercepted. "Communications indicate this is their second contact fleet. They have others." Admiral Kethvar stared at the tactical display showing humanity's true military strength spread across the star system like a metal constellation. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Indomitable hadn't been humanity's champion sent to challenge the Empire. It hadn't been their best ship or their most advanced technology. They had sent their worst ship, an obsolete vessel scheduled for scrap, to test Imperial capabilities. And it had been more than sufficient to cripple the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever known. The human flagship emerged from the center of their massive fleet like a mountain rising from the sea. The UES determination was so large that it dwarfed even the biggest Imperial dreadnought, its hull stretching for nearly 5 kilometers and bristling with more weapons than some planetary defense systems. But like everything else the humans built, it was purely functional. No elegant curves or artistic flourishes, just brutal efficiency shaped into the form of a warship. Fleet Admiral Cho's message came through on all frequencies simultaneously, broadcasted with enough power to reach every ship in both fleets. His voice carried the same calm professionalism that had become humanity's signature, but now it held the weight of absolute authority. "Zephyrian forces, we came to this region of space seeking peaceful contact with your civilization. Your actions against civilian populations on multiple worlds have demonstrated the need for immediate policy adjustment. You will stand down and prepare for negotiations." There was no anger in his voice, no hatred or desire for revenge. He spoke like a doctor, explaining a necessary medical procedure to a patient, or an engineer describing how a broken machine needed to be repaired. The destruction of entire worlds was simply a problem that required solving, and humanity had arrived with the solution. The negotiations that followed were the shortest in Imperial history. Captain Song of the Human Diplomatic Corps presented territorial maps that carved up former Imperial space with surgical precision. The terms were presented not as requests or demands, but as simple statements of fact about how things were going to work from now on. Complete withdrawal from all colonized systems within 90 standard days, reparations for civilian casualties to be paid in raw materials and industrial capacity, ongoing monitoring by human peacekeeping forces to ensure compliance with the new territorial agreements. The empire that had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years was being dismantled like a broken machine, its parts redistributed to more competent hands. "Your empire ends here," General Bay announced during the formal surrender ceremony aboard the Determination. Her words were broadcast across the galaxy, ensuring that every species would know that the age of Zephyrian dominance was over. "Consider yourselves fortunate that we prefer reconstruction to extermination. Other species might not have been so patient with your behavior. Within months, human patrol fleets established regular routes through former Imperial territory. The ships were simple and functional, carrying supplies to devastated worlds and ensuring that the peace agreements were being followed. They moved through space with the same mechanical precision that had marked their military operations, turning reconstruction into an industrial process. Admiral Kethvar, now bearing the title Governor of the Zephyrian Protectorate, stood on the observation deck of his new headquarters and watched human cargo ships delivering relief supplies to Kepler 442b. The planet he had turned into a ball of ash and rock was slowly being brought back to life through human engineering and industrial capacity. The ships were endlessly numerous, simple metal boxes that carried everything needed to rebuild a world: food, medical supplies, construction materials, terraforming equipment, and thousands of human engineers who treated planetary restoration like any other technical problem. They worked around the clock in shifts, their machines never stopping, their supply lines never failing. The galaxy had learned a harsh lesson about the true nature of power. Technological superiority meant nothing against industrial capacity that could produce unlimited numbers of adequate solutions. Individual excellence, no matter how refined, could not compete against systematic mass production of tools that were good enough to do the job. The Zephyrian Empire had spent 3 millennia believing that crafting perfect weapons was the pinnacle of military achievement. Humanity had proven that building enough decent weapons could overwhelm any amount of sophisticated craftsmanship. They had thought they knew power, but humans showed them what actual power looked like. The ability to build whatever you needed, whenever you needed it, in whatever quantities were required.